There is a hat. It's a brown felt sheriff's hat, slightly too big. The kind of thing a kid puts on because it belonged to his dad, and he wants to feel close to him. And over the course of 8 seasons of The Walking Dead, that hat becomes one of the most quietly loaded symbols in the whole show. Not because the writers made a big deal of it. Not because there's an episode where someone makes a speech about what it means. Just because of who wore it, and what happened to the person wearing it, and the fact that, by the end of the series, it's on someone else's head entirely. I've wanted to make this video for a while. Carl Grimes is one of those characters that people think they have a complete opinion on. And usually that opinion is formed around maybe 4 or 5 moments. He got shot, he killed his mum, he confronted Negan, he died. People who loved him from the very beginning. People who found him annoying through most of the middle seasons and then came around at the end, or didn't. Either way, most people think they understand Carl. I think there's a lot more to him than that. Not in a grand mythological sense. I'm not going to tell you Carl Grimes was secretly the most important character in the history of television. But I do think he was doing something genuinely interesting, quietly and consistently, across the whole run, and a lot of it got missed because the show kept putting him in the background, while the adults did the dramatic things. And then when they finally brought him forward and let him be interesting in an explicit way, they killed him. So this video is just going to spend some time with him, his smaller scenes, his stranger choices, his evolution that happened slowly enough across all those seasons that most viewers didn't fully notice it was happening. The moments where he surprised me when I went back and watched properly instead of just remembering the highlights. If you're settling in for the night, this is a good one for that. We're going to move through Carl's story in roughly chronological order, but there's no urgency about it. Each part of this stands on its own. You can follow along or let it drift over you, either works. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please consider doing that. It genuinely helps the channel, and there's a lot more of this kind of lore content in the pipeline. Now, let's start at the very beginning, which is also, somewhat appropriately, the beginning of the end of the world. Carl Grimes is introduced to us before we even properly know who Rick Grimes is. The very first thing we understand about Rick, before he wakes up in a hospital or rides a horse into Atlanta, is that he has a son and a wife, and that he and Laurie have been arguing, and that Laurie accused him of not caring about his family in front of Carl. That's the setup. Carl isn't there for that conversation. Rick is telling Shane about it, sitting in a patrol car, eating hamburgers. But he's already shaping the story before we've met him. It's a slightly unusual narrative choice when you think about it. The show wants us to understand Rick as a father before we understand him as anything else. His flaw, right at the top, is a father's flaw, the sense that the job has pulled him away from something that matters more. And then the world ends, and suddenly that's the whole situation in miniature, permanently. The job and the family fused together, no separation possible. Rick trying to protect Carl in a world that is always trying to take him. Carl is 12 when the series begins, 12 by the end of season 2, 13 during season 3, and so on up to 15 when he dies in season 8. The show runs from 2010 to 2022, and Carl is in most of it, present in the background even when the plot is focused elsewhere, carrying the hat and growing up in public view across a decade of American television. Here is a fun detail. There's a real and interesting question about what makes a child character work in long-form dramatic storytelling. Most of them don't. Most child characters in adult dramas are either precociously wise in ways that feel fake, or obstructively naive in ways that become frustrating, and there's very little middle ground. Carl manages to walk that middle ground for most of his arc, which is its own kind of achievement. He's believably young, he makes mistakes, he has the emotional inconsistency of actual adolescence, and he's also, gradually and credibly, becoming someone with a real perspective on the world. The believability of that trajectory is partly Chandler Riggs, and partly the writing, and partly just the raw fact of 8 seasons of continuous development. Chandler Riggs, the actor, was actually 10 years old when the pilot filmed. He grew up on the show, which is one of those facts that sounds simple, but gets stranger the longer you sit with it. The character of Carl was changing because the character was written to change, and because the show demanded it, but he was also changing because the boy playing him was literally growing up in front of the camera, doing the awkward teenage years on screen, with zombie apocalypse as the backdrop. There's something worth noting about that before we get into the specifics. The Carl we meet in Season 1 and the Carl we meet in Season 8 are recognisably the same person in a way that characters on most television shows are not, because the actor's physical development made that continuity unavoidable. You can see him change, you can see the years in his face, and that gives the character a kind of weight that's hard to manufacture any other way. Anyway, the hat, Rick's hat, the one he wears as a sheriff's deputy, is put on Carl's head early in Season 2, out on Herschel's farm, and Carl keeps it for most of the rest of the series. It becomes his. And near the end, in one of the last things he does, he gives it to his sister Judith. 3 grimes, 1 hat, roughly the same amount of hardship per person. We'll come back to Judith at the end, but for now, let's go back to Season 1 and spend some time with the kid. There's a scene in Season 2 that I think about more than almost any other scene in the early run of The Walking Dead, and it's not a zombie attack, or a confrontation, or anyone dying. It's just Carl and a deer. Rick and Shane are out searching the woods for something. The search for Sophia is ongoing and grinding everyone down, and they come upon a buck standing in a clearing, completely still. Just there, in the light, like it doesn't know what the world has become. Shane raises his gun to take it. Rick stops him, because Carl has started walking slowly toward the deer, and he's smiling, and nobody wants to break whatever this is. Carl moves closer. The deer watches him. Everyone watching the show kind of holds their breath, and the reason they hold their breath is that the scene has correctly identified something rare and precious, a 12-year-old boy in the apocalypse having a moment of uncomplicated wonder. He's not thinking about Sophia or walkers or where the group is going to sleep. He's thinking about the deer. He turns back to his dad, still smiling, and the smile is so completely unguarded that it's almost hard to look at. And then a gunshot comes from somewhere off in the woods. The deer drops, Carl drops. He's been shot. The transition from that image, Carl and the deer, the stillness, the smile, to Carl on the ground bleeding, happens in maybe 2 seconds. The show does it deliberately, obviously, but it still works because the contrast is so absolute. Wonder and catastrophe, right next to each other, nothing in between. Carl survives the shooting, but I always think that scene is doing more than just a plot function. It's establishing something about Carl's world specifically, the way that the most beautiful moments in it have a very short half-life. He'll spend the rest of his arc trying to find those moments again, and trying to protect them, and eventually trying to build a world where they can last a bit longer. But let's back up a little, because Carl in Season 1 doesn't get a huge amount of screen time, and it's worth at least noting what the show establishes about him early. He wakes up in a world that's already broken. That's the fundamental difference between Carl and every adult in the group. He doesn't have a before and after in the same way. Rick woke up in a hospital after a coma and had to piece together what happened. Laurie and the others had days or weeks or months of watching things fall apart, adjusting in real time. Carl was sleeping or at school or just living his life, and then suddenly the world was different and his mum was pulling him out of their house and telling him to run. His cognitive relationship to the apocalypse is different from the adults because he never really had the chance to grieve the old world. He just arrived in the new one. That sounds like it might make things easier. It doesn't really. What it does is remove a certain kind of reference point. Carl doesn't spend a lot of time missing what things used to be like, because he's young enough that what things used to be like hasn't finished being formed yet. His sense of normal is in the process of being established when the world changes. So the apocalypse doesn't break his sense of normal, it becomes part of it. Laurie and Rick argue about this throughout Season 1 and most of Season 2. Laurie wants to protect Carl from the worst of it. Rick wants to prepare him for the worst of it. They're both right and both wrong, in the way parents usually are when they're trying to figure out something that doesn't have a clear answer. At one point early on, Carl asks to be taught to shoot. Laurie says no. Rick, quietly, starts teaching him anyway. Not because Rick doesn't love his son or doesn't want to protect him, but because Rick has thought a step further ahead and knows that the ability to protect yourself is currently, in this world, more valuable than the feeling of being protected. That tension between Carl being kept safe and Carl being equipped runs through the entire first 2 seasons and into the third. And Carl, for his part, pushes consistently in one direction. He wants to be useful. He wants to be trusted. He keeps finding guns and not handing them over. He keeps following people into situations he's been told to stay out of. Not out of recklessness exactly. More like impatience with the gap between what he can see is needed and what the adults are willing to let him do. There's a moment in Season 1 where Carl goes into the woods with a small group and helps deal with a situation that comes up. And there's this brief beat afterwards where Shane looks at him with something like respect and then looks immediately uncomfortable about the fact that he's looking at a 12-year-old with respect. Shane is not a subtle character, but that moment is nicely observed. Carl is already pushing at the edges of what a child is supposed to be in this context. Season 2 is spent almost entirely on Herschel's farm, which is one of those narrative decisions that look strange in retrospect but made sense at the time. The farm gives Carl space to be a kid in a way the road doesn't. There's a bed, there are other people, there's some approximation of routine. He makes friends with the farm kids, sort of. He's curious about everything. He's also deeply attached to Rick in a way that the show communicates mostly through proximity. Carl is almost always physically near his dad when both of them are in a scene. It's not a clingy thing, it's more like gravitational. Rick is Carl's anchor, and Carl being near Rick is how you can tell, without anyone saying it, that Carl still feels like a child, even as the situation is pushing him to stop being one. The shooting, the deer, the ground, all the bullet fragments changes things. Herschel extracts one fragment and tells them there are 5 more that require surgery. They need a respirator and equipment from a local FEMA post. Shane and Otis go. What happens to Otis is one of Season 2's nastier revelations, but what happens to Carl is that he almost dies and Rick almost loses him. And after that, Rick's approach shifts. Not dramatically, not in a single decision, but the urgency with which he starts preparing Carl for the world gets quiet and real. Carl recovers from his earlier injuries, but later dies from a walker bite. He comes through. And then Sophia comes out of the barn. The Sophia storyline is one of the show's genuinely well-constructed slow burns, the kind of thing that frustrates people at the time and makes more sense on rewatch. The group spends most of Season 2's first half searching the countryside for a little girl who disappeared in the woods, and the whole time she's in the barn, dead, already turned. What does that mean for Carl specifically? He knew Sophia. Not well, they weren't particularly close friends, but she was just some girl from the group, the same approximate age, someone he'd shared the same dwindling sense of normal with, and she ended up in the barn, and Rick shoots her. The show doesn't spend a huge amount of time on Carl's reaction to that. He's there, he watches, and then the season moves on. But I think the Sophia situation is quietly formative for Carl in ways the show doesn't explicitly articulate. It establishes very early that children in this world are not specially protected, that being young doesn't insulate you from the worst of what can happen. Sophia tried to survive and didn't. Carl tried to survive and did. The difference between those two outcomes is not entirely explainable. He picks up a gun around Season 2 and he keeps it. Laurie's objections get quieter. Rick stops fighting it. The hat goes on his head and stays there most of the time. And by the end of Season 2, something else happens. Shane dies. And Rick is the one who ends it. But the Season 2 version of Carl, the kid who smiled at the deer, who almost died on Herschel's table, who watched Rick shoot Sophia, who kept the gun, who started to carry the hat, that Carl is already someone who has made some fundamental decisions about what kind of person he's going to try to be. Not out loud, not in a speech, just in the accumulation of small choices, week after week, in a world that doesn't reward waiting. He's 12 years old. He's already done more deciding than most adults do in years of ordinary life. There's something in that that's both impressive and deeply sad. The show is smart enough to know that both things are true at once, even when it doesn't quite know what to do with that knowledge. One more thing about Season 2, Carl, before we move on. In the episode where the group is at the church briefly, one of those abandoned rural churches that the show used so well as locations, Carl finds a gun on the floor of the vestibule and pockets it without telling anyone. Later, the gun becomes relevant in a way that's complicated, but the image itself is worth holding on to. A kid alone in a church finding a gun on the floor and putting it in his pocket with the calm efficiency of someone who has already decided that guns are tools, and tools are useful. Some drama, some hesitation. 12 years old. The Season 2 finale is called Beside the Dying Fire, and it is, by the standards of the show's first 2 seasons, a very busy episode. The farm gets overrun, the barn goes up in flames, the group scatters and reconvenes on the highway, and the prison eventually looms on the horizon. A lot happens, but the thing I want to talk about happens early, in the woods, in the dark, and it involves 3 people: Rick, Shane and Carl. Shane Walsh has been unravelling since Season 1, slowly, and then all at once in the way these things tend to go. He was Rick's best friend and Laurie's protector in the months when Rick was in a coma. And then Rick came back, and Shane had to figure out how to be in a world where the man he'd started to replace had returned. He did not figure it out well. Season 2 is essentially the story of Shane's deterioration and Rick's dawning understanding of what Shane has become. By the finale, Rick knows Shane is going to kill him. Shane leads Rick into the woods on a pretext, and it becomes very clear, very quickly, that only one of them is walking out of those trees. They fight. Rick stabs Shane, Shane dies, and then Shane reanimates as a walker, because the rules of the world have recently clarified that everyone comes back, bite or no bite, and Rick, his dead best friend, now walking toward him in the dark, with a killing look in his eyes, raises his gun. He can't do it. And then a shot rings out, and Shane drops, and the camera finds Carl standing in the tree line, 12 years old, holding the gun that he'd quietly pocketed in the church weeks earlier. He shot Shane. Not a walker. Shane, his father's best friend, the man who had been something close to a second father to him for a while. Carl knew what he was shooting at. He could see. He took a moment, he aimed, and he fired. And he looks at his father after, and the look on his face is not traumatized or uncertain. It's something more like, I saw what needed to happen and I did it. This moment gets acknowledged by the other characters, and then the show essentially moves past it, because the barn is on fire, and there are walkers everywhere, and things need to happen. But I don't think the show moves past it as completely as it might appear to. Everything Carl does in the next 3 or 4 seasons grows in some way from this route. He saved his father, he made the hardest possible version of the decision Rick couldn't make, and he did it at 12 years old, in the dark, with a gun he wasn't supposed to have. The interesting question isn't whether Carl was right to do it. In the terms of the world the show has built, he probably was. Shane was going to keep being a danger to the group, yes, and specifically to Rick, and Carl knew it, and Carl acted on it. The interesting question is what it does to a kid to be right about something like that. To know that he made the correct call and that the correct call was killing someone. What the show is quietly arguing is that Carl has gotten somewhere, philosophically, that the adults haven't reached yet. Rick kills Shane because he has to, in the moment, when it's him or Shane. Carl kills Shane as Walker because he can see what his father can't do, and he does it instead. That's a different kind of decision. That's choosing to act on a clear-eyed assessment of the situation, rather than reacting under pressure. That's in some ways more deliberate than what Rick does, which is unsettling at 12, but it also sets up something that becomes a recurring pattern with Carl. He arrives at the hard conclusions before the adults do, and then he acts on them, and then the adults have to decide how to feel about the fact that the kid got there first. Season 3 gives us a famous example of this. Season 4 gives us another. Each time the structure is essentially the same. Carl sees what needs to happen, does it, and the group doesn't quite know how to process that. There's a through line from Shane all the way to Carl's final act of saving himself, insisting on being the one to pull the trigger when he's dying, so his father and Michonne don't have to. That's the same logic, applied at the end. I can see what needs to happen, I can do it, let me do it. Now I want to spend a moment on Laurie here, because the Shane situation connects to the Laurie situation in Season 3, and it's worth being clear about that. When Laurie goes into labour in the prison, and the situation becomes very dangerous, very fast, Carl ends up in the room when Laurie dies, and then Laurie reanimates, and Carl has to deal with that too. The show handles this with unusual restraint. We hear the shot from outside the room, we don't see it, but we know what happened, and we know who did it. 2 seasons, 2 people Carl loved in some complicated way, and Carl is the one who ends it both times. The show is not being gratuitously cruel with this pattern, though it might look that way. What it's doing is establishing that Carl has a specific and terrible capacity for accepting what is necessary in moments when the people around him can't. That's a strength in the world of The Walking Dead. It's also a burden that no 12 or 13-year-old should be carrying. Rick doesn't talk to Carl about the Laurie situation for a long time. There's a famous scene in Season 3 where Rick finds Carl and tries to say something about it, and can't. And Carl is calm and slightly distant, and Rick ends up being the one who seems more upset. That dynamic Carl composed, Rick unravelling slightly in Carl's direction, appears more than once. Rick is the adult, but Carl, in these moments, is the one who seems more settled in the fact of what happened. I don't think Carl is unaffected. I think he gets very good, very young, at not letting affect show. That's a different thing. The other thing worth noting about the Shane situation is that Carl picked up the gun from the church without telling anyone, and then the gun turned out to be necessary. If he'd handed it over like he was supposed to, or if he'd told Rick he'd found it, the situation in the woods might have ended differently. His small act of keeping something for himself just in case ended up mattering enormously. Carl makes that kind of calculation a lot. He keeps things in reserve. He thinks ahead in small practical ways that the show doesn't always make explicit. The gun in the church is one example. The way he scouts locations when the group settles somewhere new is another. He's not doing it dramatically or because the plot requires it. He's doing it because he's the kind of person who looks at where the exits are before he sits down. And he's 13. Shane Walsh, by the way, is a character the show treats more fairly in retrospect than it did at the time. He was right about a lot of things, including the fact that the group was going to have to make harder choices than most of them were prepared to make. He was just wrong about almost everything else, including the methods. Carl probably understood this. He loved Shane in that complicated way kids love complicated adults, and he shot him anyway. That's the thing with Shane. It doesn't resolve neatly. It just is. And Carl carries it forward without making a big deal of it, the way he carries most things. Let's move on to the prison, which is where Carl starts to become someone you can't ignore. And there's a dimension to the Shane situation that the show gestures at without fully exploring, which is Carl's grief. He does grieve Shane. Not dramatically, Carl doesn't collapse. He doesn't talk about it at length. The show doesn't give him a scene of visible mourning. But Shane was a real presence in Carl's life for an important stretch of it, especially the months after Rick's shooting, when Shane was the closest thing to a father Carl had. Shane taught him things. Shane paid attention to him. The relationship was complicated and shaped by Shane's feelings for Laurie in ways Carl couldn't fully understand, but the time was real. Killing someone you've grieved or will grieve is a different thing from killing a stranger. Carl has to hold both of those things, the loss and the action, without much support, because explaining the full complexity of what he's feeling would require words he doesn't quite have yet, and adults who have space to receive them. And neither of those things is currently available. He carries it forward the way he carries everything forward, quietly in the background, shaping the person he's becoming in ways that only become visible later. That's the thing with Shane. It doesn't resolve neatly, it just is. Season 3 opens with the group moving through a house, clearing rooms, killing walkers, searching for supplies, and it's immediately clear that something has changed. Not just in the situation, but in the choreography. Carl is part of the unit. He's moving with the adults, covering angles, operating with the kind of quiet competence that only comes from months of doing it repeatedly. When they check a room, he checks his corner. When they need to move, he moves. Nobody is treating him like a liability. Nobody is telling him to stay back. 8 months have passed since the end of Season 2. The time jump is communicated in a few ways, but the most striking one is just watching Carl exist in the group's formation. He's 13 now, technically, though Chandler Riggs was clearly doing the thing all teenage boys do, where one summer produces what looks like 3 years of growth. He's taller, his jaw is different, and he holds a silenced pistol with the ease of someone who has been doing it for a long time. That physical transformation combined with the 8-month gap is how the show communicates to you, without a monologue, without anyone explicitly saying so, that the farm was the last place Carl was allowed to be young. Whatever was left of his childhood ended in those 8 months on the road. When the group finds the prison and starts to clear it, Carl is part of that operation too. He helps in the initial push through the yard. He takes a guard tower alongside Herschel, and when the situation gets complicated and Herschel gets bitten on his calf and Rick amputates his leg with a hatchet, and the whole thing becomes an extremely stressful afternoon, Carl is there managing his corner of it without falling apart. And then the prisoners appear, 5 men who have been locked in the cafeteria since the beginning of the outbreak, completely isolated, with a warped and fragmentary understanding of what's happened to the world. The mix of those men with Rick's group over the following episodes is one of Season 3's more interesting subplots. But what I want to focus on is Carl's position in it. Carl at the prison is in some ways the most fully realised version of who he is as a character. He has a cell, he has a routine, he exists within a community, small as it is, and he navigates that community with a self-awareness that's genuinely surprising. He knows what the adults think of him, he knows when he's being managed, and he pushes back on it in ways that are mostly quiet but occasionally direct. The moment with the surrendering prisoner is the most famous example. A teenage boy from the prison population, roughly Carl's age, is running, or appears to be running, to get help or reinforcement during a dangerous situation. Carl shoots him. The boy has his hands up. Carl shoots him anyway. Rick is furious. The group is uncomfortable. And Carl's response to being confronted about it is neither defensive nor remorseful in the conventional sense. He makes an argument. He says the boy was a threat. He says he made an assessment and acted on it, and he believes he was right. He doesn't have the emotional vocabulary to be perfectly articulate about it, but the logic is clear enough. Better to err on the side of the group's safety than risk the group's safety on the chance that someone with his hands up actually means no harm. The show doesn't fully vindicate this position. It doesn't fully condemn it either. Rick punishes Carl for what he did by taking away his gun, which is the only meaningful punishment available. Carl accepts the punishment without much argument, but he doesn't recant the position. He thinks he made the right call. He might have been right. The show leaves it open in a way that feels honest. There is no clean answer here, and the show knows it. This is where Carl starts to diverge from Rick in ways that matter. Rick's entire arc is built around a man trying to hold on to his humanity while making inhuman decisions. feeling the weight of every hard choice, carrying the guilt of every compromise. Carl, by contrast, is building a philosophy rather than carrying guilt. He's thinking through what the rules should be, not mourning the fact that the rules have changed. The difference is subtle, but it runs all the way to the end. Around season 3, there's also a scene that I think is easily missed, but that I find genuinely touching, which is Carl and Herschel out in the yard. Herschel has recovered from his amputation. He's one of those characters who recovers from things that should kill people, which is its own kind of statement the show's making, and he and Carl go outside together, ostensibly to pick elderberries or check the perimeter or something practical. There are walkers on the other side of the fence, deteriorated and mostly harmless at this stage. Carl prepares to shoot one out of habit. Herschel stops him. There's no need. The walker isn't a threat. Carl looks at the walker for a moment, and then he just puts the gun away and keeps walking. It's maybe 20 seconds of screen time, but it's the first time we see someone successfully persuade Carl that restraint is a choice rather than a weakness. And the fact that it's Herschel is interesting. Not Rick, not Daryl, but the old farmer with one leg who has thought more carefully about what decency costs than almost anyone else in the group. Carl has a specific kind of respect for Herschel that he doesn't have for most of the adults. Herschel tells him the truth about things and doesn't talk down to him and treats his opinions as worth engaging with. In return, Carl is gentler around Herschel than he is around almost anyone. There's a warmth there that doesn't need to be announced. The other thing that season 3 gives us is Carl suggesting to Rick that Rick should step down as leader. This happens on the catwalk above the prison yard, with walkers milling around below, and the governor somewhere in the background, planning terrible things. Carl says Rick should let Herschel and Daryl handle things. He says Rick deserves a rest. He's not being cruel. He's being 14 and direct, but the observation isn't wrong either. Rick at that point is carrying things in ways that are visibly affecting his judgment, and the people who might be better positioned to make clear-headed decisions are not being given the room to do so. Carl sees this. He says it, and then Negan goes back to his cell. Rick doesn't take the advice, but the fact that Carl could offer it, calmly, without agenda, as a genuine practical observation, says something about where he's gotten to. He's not a child who defers to his father anymore. He's a person who has his own views and is willing to state them. There's also the governor, obviously. The prison storyline's main conflict. Carl doesn't interact with the governor much directly, but the governor's presence shapes Carl's season 3 arc in a structural way, because the threat of the governor is what forces the prison community into a constant defensive posture. And it's in that posture that Carl finds his function. He's part of the defense, he's reliable, and when the prison falls eventually and the group scatters, Carl is the one who finds Rick on the road and more or less carries him for a while. That's a season 4 thing, but it's worth previewing. After the prison breaks apart, it's Carl who keeps Rick alive and functional in the days when Rick is so battered, physically and emotionally, that he barely moves. Carl scavenges. Carl keeps watch. Carl goes out and does what needs to be done, while Rick lies on a sofa and stares at the ceiling. And Carl gets frightened and angry and young during that period in a way that the rest of season 3 doesn't show. It all comes out in those quiet, strange episodes after the prison falls. But that's getting ahead of things. For now, let's stay at the prison a little longer, because there's one more version of Carl worth spending time with here. The prison kid who is, beneath the competence and the philosophy and the gun, still very much a teenager. He reads comics. He keeps a collection of them in his cell. She gives one to Carl when she's returning, and he reads it, and they have a small, easy moment of connection over it. He has a clear fondness for pudding that he shows with genuine enthusiasm. He is curious about everything, about the old world, about how things used to be, about the people in the group, and what their lives were like before. When he meets Morgan in season 3, and Morgan is clearly not doing well psychologically, Carl's approach to him is gentle and interested. He doesn't push, he just pays attention. He's a weird kid in the way teenagers are sometimes weird, interested in odd things, emotionally inconsistent, capable of extraordinary self-possession in one moment and ordinary adolescent sullenness in the next. And the prison, for all its obvious horrors, is the place where that kid gets to exist most fully. He has a space, he has people, he has Herschel. When the prison falls, he loses all of that. And for a while, on the road with a barely functional Rick, he is very much a child again, scared and grieving, and doing what he has to do because there is no one else to do it. There's a version of the Carl story where the I is the most important thing that happens to him, where everything before it is prologue and everything after it is defined by the fact that he's missing one. And then there's the version the show actually presents, which is that Carl loses an eye in season 6, spends about half an episode in a coma, while Rick has his best moment in the entire series, and then wakes up, puts a bandage on, and goes back to existing. The show is somewhat deliberately understated about the eye, which is an interesting choice. It doesn't make it a huge deal in terms of Carl's ongoing characterization. He adapts, he compensates. By season 7 and 8, he's moving through the world essentially the same way he did before, just with a different face. The show seems to be saying something like, this is a person who has survived worse than losing an eye. An eye is survivable, it's fine. But to understand the context of the eye, you have to understand what's happening during the Alexandria arc in season 5 and 6, because that's where Carl's story picks up in interesting ways, after the chaos of the prison's fall and the back half of season 4. Alexandria is the first actual community the group has been part of since the prison, and the contrast with what they've been through between those two places is significant. Houses with electricity and running water and organised food supplies, and people who still have regular emotions and comfortable clothes and a functioning sort of society. Carl's first interview with Deanna, the woman running Alexandria, is notable. When she offers her condolences about his mother, Carl says, very matter-of-factly, that he didn't just lose her, he had to be the one to kill her. And then he and Deanna sit there with that for a second. That's the Carl who arrives in Alexandria, the one who can say that sentence in that way, with that much directness and that little performance of distress, to a stranger he's just met. And his observation about the Alexandrians after the first few days, that he likes them but they're weak, and he doesn't want them to get weak too, is again not cruel. It's practical in a way that sounds cold if you're not used to how he talks by this point. His relationship with the existing residents is complicated. Ron Anderson, who's roughly his age, has obvious reasons to be hostile to the Grimes family. Rick eventually kills Ron's father, Pete, who is abusive, but who is also still Ron's father, and Ron doesn't really get over that. There's a slow-burning tension between Carl and Ron that the show never quite gives the space to be properly explored. They try to be around each other. It doesn't really work. Enid is someone we'll come back to properly in the next section, because that relationship deserves its own space. But during the mid-season 6 chaos, the enormous herd that breaks through Alexandria's walls, things happen fast and badly. Ron tries to shoot Rick. Carl gets in the way. The shot goes through Carl's eye, and what follows is one of the show's genuinely good sequences. Rick carrying Carl through the streets, killing walkers with one hand, the look on Rick's face, which is not a face the show had really shown before. Rick has been frightened for Carl plenty of times. This is something beyond that. This is Rick operating on pure will, because the alternative is not an option he can accept. They make it to the infirmary. Denise works on Carl, and then Rick goes back outside. What Rick does next, going out into the overrun streets of Alexandria and starting to fight, alone, drawing walkers to him, burning with the kind of focus that grief and desperation produce, ends up pulling the entire community out to fight alongside him. It's one of Rick's best moments in the series, and it's motivated entirely by Carl. Carl almost dying is what breaks something open in Rick and produces this. Carl wakes up. He survives. And when he does, Rick sits by his bed and tells him that when he was out there, he started to see what Alexandria could become, that he wants to show Carl the new world, that for the first time in a long time, he actually believes there's going to be a new world to show him. It's a genuinely lovely scene, and it's one of those cases where the show does something right without fanfare. It places the narrative function of Carl's injury not in what it does to Carl, but in what it does to Rick and what it does to the community. Carl's resilience, the fact that he comes through a gunshot through the eye and just gets on with it, is not the point. The point is that people rallied around the possibility of losing him. That says something about what Carl means to the group, even when the plot isn't centered on him. He's the living embodiment of the argument that there's a future worth protecting. Not because he's a child who needs protecting. By season 6, that argument has mostly dissolved, but because he represents continuity. He's been here since the start. He's growing up. He's 17 in season 8, and you can see where he's going. You can imagine who he'd be at 25 if he got there. And that imagination is one of the things that keeps people going in the apocalypse. The idea that someone gets to grow up. The bandage over the eye socket becomes Carl's visual signature in the later seasons. It's not played for pity or for horror, it just becomes part of how he looks. And in a weird way, it suits him. It's a permanent, visible record of what he's survived, worn practically, without drama. There's a small detail in season 6's aftermath that I like quite a bit. Carl is recovering, still bandaged, still not fully mobile, and someone asks him if he needs anything, and he asks for a book. Just a book. He wants something to read. It's such a teenager thing to do in the middle of everything. He nearly died. He's going to be carrying this injury for the rest of his life. And what he wants in recovery is something to read. There's also a longer arc in season 6's back half, where Carl is essentially grounded while he recovers. And the show uses this to let him be quieter and more observational than he usually gets to be. He watches Alexandria from within the walls in a way he hasn't done since the very first days there. He notices things he didn't notice before. There's a version of the Carl-Enid dynamic that develops specifically during this period, Enid checking in on him, the two of them spending time in proximity without much needing to be said. The recovery period is, oddly, one of the times when Carl gets to be most normal, because being normal is what recovery looks like. He reads, he draws, he thinks. When he's well enough to go back out, the eye is covered and he moves differently, slightly more careful on one side, compensating for the absent peripheral vision. But it's a small adjustment. Functionally, he's back to himself very quickly, and that speed of return is itself a statement about the character. He doesn't let the loss define him for long. He takes it, he incorporates it, he keeps going. The Ron situation resolves badly, as these situations tend to. Ron dies in the same chaos that takes Carl's eye, along with his mother Jessie and his brother Sam. Jessie and her sons, gone in a few minutes of that same mid-season attack. Carl doesn't visibly mourn them, but he also doesn't have the chance to. Everything happens so fast. What the eye does ultimately is give Carl a new face for the back half of the series, one that carries all of that visible history. When you look at season 7 and 8, Carl, you're looking at someone who has been shot twice, survived a zombie apocalypse from childhood, lost his mother, lost the prison, and kept going. The bandage is a shorthand for all of that. It doesn't need explanation. And then he meets Negan. Enid's introduction in season 5 is brief and odd. She's just there suddenly, an Alexandrian teenager, and she doesn't say much, and Carl notices her almost immediately. He notices her sneaking over the wall one evening. He follows her into the woods. He loses her. And that's actually a pretty good encapsulation of their dynamic in its early stages. Carl paying attention, Enid moving ahead, the pursuit never quite catching up into anything fully formed. Her backstory, when we eventually get it, is brutal and communicated in fragments. She watched her parents die in the early days of the outbreak. She scratched JSS into the dirt. Just survived somehow, and kept moving. She ended up at Alexandria, where she lives inside the walls and also, frequently, outside them because the walls were never quite enough to make her feel safe, and also because she is 16 and slightly feral in the way teenagers become when they haven't had enough structure for long enough. JSS, as a philosophy, is interesting when you put it next to how Carl operates. Carl has moved well beyond just survive somehow by the time they meet. He's thinking about what comes after survival, what kind of person to be while surviving, what the rules should be, what the future could look like. Enid is still in the survival mode in some ways, or rather, she's learnt not to invest in things, because the things you invest in tend to get taken away. What Carl does almost from the beginning is treat her as someone worth investing in. Not romantically at first, just as someone whose perspective is interesting and whose company is worth pursuing. He's curious about her. He doesn't push exactly, but he keeps turning up in her vicinity. He waits her out. One of the quieter threads in their dynamic is the way Carl responds to Enid's habit of leaving. She goes over the wall. She disappears. She doesn't explain, and Carl, instead of being bothered by this in the defensive way most people would be, just accepts it as part of how she is and keeps being around when she comes back. He doesn't make her justify herself. That's unusual, and Enid notices it, even if she doesn't comment on it directly. There's a scene where Carl actually follows her over the wall into the woods, and they spend time outside together. This is before any of the Season 6 drama, when the woods are the woods rather than a battlefield. And what's striking about it is that they don't do anything in particular. They walk, they talk about small things. Carl is interested in what Enid knows about the area from her time outside the walls, and Enid is interested in Carl's apparent lack of anxiety about being outside without proper backup. And the conversation meanders in the way good conversations do without needing to arrive anywhere in particular. That ease is what you're watching in the roller skating scene too, the ease of two people who have figured out that they don't need to perform anything for each other. Carl doesn't need to perform toughness around Enid. Enid doesn't need to perform stability around Carl. They can just be what they are, which is teenagers in an extraordinary situation, doing the best they can. There's something in that pattern that's very Carl. The long patience, the willingness to be present without demanding anything in return. He does this with Michonne too, in a different way. During the early prison seasons, he has a capacity for affectionate persistence that the show doesn't quite know what to do with, but that reads as a consistent character trait across multiple relationships. The roller skating scene is the one everyone remembers from their dynamic, and it deserves its reputation. It's Season 6, somewhere in the back half, and Carl and Enid have spent some time navigating the woods between Alexandria and the hilltop for reasons I won't get too detailed about. They find roller skates in a bag by the road, and Carl puts them on, and Enid puts them on. And they skate down an empty road holding hands, and it is genuinely, disarmingly, almost absurdly sweet. I don't know quite how to describe why that scene works as well as it does. Partly it's the tonal contrast, everything around it is serious and dangerous. Partly it's the simplicity of the image, two teenagers holding hands on skates, which is a thing teenagers do when the world is normal and also, apparently, when it's not. Partly it's the fact that the show has never, before this moment, allowed Carl to be just a teenager in a completely uncomplicated way, and here he is briefly being exactly that. For Enid, the moment is significant too. She spends most of her time in the series keeping people at a deliberate distance, not coldly, just carefully. The emotional logic of JSS is that you don't attach yourself to things because things go away. Carl skating with her and holding her hand is her letting that logic go, temporarily. Just existing in a nice moment because the nice moment is available. They kiss later in Season 7, when Carl is setting out to find Negan, and Enid knows he might not come back. It's not a dramatic kiss, they're not the show's central romance, and the show is smart enough to not oversell them, but it carries the weight of everything that hasn't been said. She asks him not to go. He goes anyway. She watches him leave. One of the things I find genuinely moving about Carl and Enid, looking back on it, is that their relationship happens almost entirely in the margins of the main plot. The show is usually focused somewhere else when they're together. You have to pay attention to catch the full arc of it, and most viewers are probably watching Carl's bigger, more plot-relevant scenes, and only half registering these quieter ones. But the quieter ones are doing a lot. They're showing you who Carl is when he's not solving a problem, or making a moral choice, or confronting someone. They're showing you the version of him that got to exist between the emergencies. And that version of him, the kid who steals roller skates and coaxes a guarded girl into holding his hand on an empty road, is maybe the most affecting version of all. Because it's the one that wasn't going to get to grow up. Enid is killed by Alpha in season 9 and is not alive when the series ends, eventually. She has her own story, her own losses, her own continuation. Carl's death hits her hard in season 8 in a way that the show handles quietly. She doesn't have a big scene of grieving. She just exists differently afterwards. Slightly more closed, slightly more JSS. Which is sad. But it's also honest about what these losses do to people. You survive and you carry it, and you keep going, and you don't always find words for it. There's a really small moment, well before any of the season 7 drama, where Carl gives Enid a comic book. Just hands it to her. She looks at it. He doesn't make a big deal of it. She takes it. That's it. The scene exists for maybe 15 seconds, and it has no plot function, and I think about it kind of a lot. That's Carl, really. The handover of small things. The person who keeps notice of what other people might want or need, and just quietly provides it without announcement. He does it with Michonne, a letter he writes to her, that he leaves somewhere she'll find it. He does it with Judith, in small consistent ways across multiple seasons. He does it with Enid, with a comic book and roller skates. It's one of the softer textures of the character, and it tends to get overshadowed by the harder stuff. The shooting, the philosophy, the confrontations. But it's there, consistently, running underneath all of it. Since we're talking about Carl in the world between crises, let's move to the thing that seems like it should be terrifying, but turns out to be one of the most interesting hours of Carl's whole story. Let's talk about the visit to the sanctuary. In season 7, episode 7, there is a supply truck making its way from Hilltop back to the sanctuary. In the back of that truck, among the cargo, is Carl Grimes. He got in there on purpose. He's 16, one-eyed, has a machine gun, and his plan is to get to the sanctuary, find Negan, and kill him. That's the whole plan. There's no exit strategy. There's no backup. He's just going to walk into the most fortified enemy compound the show has depicted and kill the man with the barbed wire bat. He had kissed Enid before he left. She knew he might not come back. He probably knew it too. What happens when the truck arrives at the sanctuary is not what you'd expect, and I think that's exactly why this episode, Sing Me a Song, which is one of the more divisive episodes of season 7 because it's almost entirely about Negan, showing Carl around his compound. And some people found it indulgent, and those people were wrong. It's one of the most important Carl episodes in the whole series. Carl gets out of the truck. He shoots 2 saviors. He demands to know where Negan is. He's caught. He has a machine gun pointed at him, and Negan comes out. Negan's immediate response to finding a one-eyed teenage boy who just killed 2 of his men, and is now standing there with a gun pointed at him, completely unafraid, is something like delighted surprise. He is genuinely impressed, he says so. He doesn't mock Carl, he doesn't immediately threaten him, he says something like, "Wow, he's got guts about Daryl." Most kids would have cried. Carl does cry. This establishes immediately the dynamic between them for the rest of the episode and for the rest of the series. Negan respects Carl in a way that is unusual for Negan and is completely unrelated to any usefulness Carl might have. He respects him the way you respect someone who walks into your house and tries to kill you, and is genuinely prepared to accept the consequences. It's a specific kind of respect that Negan is capable of, and that very few people in the show earn from him. Negan gives Carl a tour. This is the part of the episode that makes some viewers impatient. It's long, it's detailed, it spends a lot of time showing how the sanctuary functions, who the people in it are, how Negan maintains his authority, but for understanding Carl's arc, it's essential. Because Carl is watching all of this very carefully and filing it away. He's not just being taken on a victory lap by his captor, he's studying. At one point, Negan has Carl take off the bandage over his empty eye socket. It's an uncomfortable scene. Negan says he wants to see it. Carl resists. Negan pushes. Carl takes it off. And then Negan, after looking at the wound, which is, to be clear, a raw empty eye socket, not a clean prosthetic, makes a comment that is tactless and probably hurtful, and Carl starts to cry. Which is interesting, because Carl has been the most composed person in multiple, extremely stressful situations throughout the series. He cried when his mother died. But confronting armed adults, navigating mortal danger, making terrible decisions, he's done all of that dry-eyed. And here, in a moment that's nominally less dangerous than many of those, he cries. Negan, to his mild credit, pulls back. He says he forgets sometimes. He apologises, which is almost unheard of from Negan. He gives Carl his bandage back. There's a theory about why that moment lands differently for Carl than everything else he's been through, and I think it has something to do with the eye being specifically about his face, his appearance, his adolescence. Carl can handle violence and danger with the equanimity of someone who has processed that violence and danger a part of his life. But someone commenting on the thing that makes him look wrong, that makes him look like someone who has been damaged in a way that doesn't heal, that's a different wound. That's the 13-year-old still in there, the one who doesn't have the armour on in that specific place. Then Negan asks Carl to sing a song. This is where the episode becomes genuinely strange. Carl, sitting across from the man who killed two of his group with a barbed wire bat while his father was on his knees in the road, starts singing. He sings, "You Are My Sunshine." He sings it quietly and without much performance, like a kid doing something he's been told to do, and Negan listens, and something in Negan's face shifts, briefly, into something that isn't performance. The choice of "You Are My Sunshine" is deliberate. It's a song about loss dressed up as a song about love. "You'll never know, dear, how much I love you. Please don't take my sunshine away." Sung by a boy to a man who has taken things from him, in the middle of a compound full of people who've had things taken from them by the same man. The layers are not subtle, but they work. After the song, Negan drives Carl home. He doesn't hurt him. He sends him back to Rick, which is its own kind of message, Negan doing the generous thing specifically, because it will unsettle Rick more than anything violent would. But there's something in the decision to send Carl home specifically that isn't just strategic. There's also the question of what Negan does with Carl while they're still at the sanctuary, before the drive home. He takes him to see his wives, the women who have been coerced into a particular social arrangement that the show presents as one of the darkest things about how Negan runs things. Carl watches and doesn't say much, and seems to be cataloguing. He sees the fear underneath the performance. He sees the people in that compound doing what they've learnt they have to do. He's taking notes on the gap between how things are presented and how they actually are. This is, again, very Carl. He notices the gap between surface and substance. He files it away. The sanctuary visit gives him more specific information about the Saviour's social architecture than anyone else in Rick's group has, because nobody else got the tour. There's a brief beat during the sanctuary visit where one of the Saviours, one of Negan's more enthusiastic lieutenants, makes a comment to Carl about what's going to happen to him, and Carl's response is a flat look that communicates, without words, that he's not particularly impressed by the threat. The Saviour is unsettled by this. It's a small thing, but it's consistent. Carl does not perform fear for people who are trying to get him to perform fear. What he does perform, very occasionally, is patience. He waits Negan out, he answers questions, he sings when asked, He takes off the bandage when Negan pushes hard enough, but he's doing all of it with a kind of measured compliance that is not submission. He's giving Negan what Negan wants in order to get what Carl needs, which is time to observe and an exit. It's a more tactical response than most adults in the group would manage in the same situation. The show comes back to this in a later season. Negan, in a conversation about Carl, says he would never kill a kid. This is complicated because Negan absolutely uses children as leverage and creates the conditions in which children are endangered, but the specific claim that he would not personally kill a child seems to be true. And with Carl, it's more than that. Negan actively likes Carl, he respects him. In a later encounter, when Carl shows up again with a gun, because Carl does this more than once, Negan's reaction is somewhere between exasperation and fondness. What Carl takes away from the sanctuary visit is the seed of a theory that changes the whole back end of his arc. He's been inside. He's seen the people there, ordinary people, a lot of them, people who were doing something before and are now doing something else. People who follow Negan because following Negan is what you do if you want to keep living, not because they love him or believe in him. He's seen Negan's room, Negan's bat, Negan's somewhat theatrical operation of the whole thing, and he's seen the moment when Negan apologised, the moment when something broke through. Carl is 16. He's been in the apocalypse since he was 11. He's made hard choices and watched people die and built a worldview that is harder and more pragmatic than almost anyone else his age could construct. And what he concludes, after the sanctuary visit, is that Negan is reachable, that the war doesn't have to end in Negan's death, that there is something in there, in the man behind the performance, that could go a different direction. This is not a naive conclusion. It comes from a specific conversation, a specific observation, a specific moment in which Negan's armour cracked briefly. Carl isn't deciding to trust Negan. He's deciding that Negan is a person, and that persons can change, and that a world where Negan changes is better than a world where Negan dies, and someone else takes his place. He doesn't tell Rick this in a way Rick can hear. Rick is too deep in the war by this point, too committed to the position that Negan has to be destroyed. But Carl starts writing it down, which we'll come to. One more thing about the sanctuary visit. When Carl is waiting to be dealt with by Negan, and Negan is making everyone else in the room leave, a saviour looks at Carl and says something threatening, and Carl looks back at him and doesn't flinch. The saviour leaves. Carl sits there. There's this quality Carl has, that he's had since at least season 3, of making people uncomfortable by not reacting the way they expect him to react. Adults expect a teenager to be afraid or defiant or erratic. Carl is frequently just steady, not cold steady. He watches, he waits, he decides. Negan noticed it at the sanctuary. It's one of the reasons Negan respects him. It's also one of the reasons it's such a loss when Carl dies. The show loses its most quietly steady character, and it doesn't quite find a replacement. The season 8 premiere opens with Carl at a petrol station, scavenging for supplies. A man appears, nervous, thin, asking for help in English with an Arabic accent. He quotes the Quran. He says he just wants food. He seems genuine. Carl lowers his gun. He's considering it. Rick appears, fires 2 shots over the man's head, chases him away. Carl and Rick drive back to Alexandria, and Carl tells Rick that hope isn't enough. Not enough to just hope things work out. Not enough to just hope that someone who says they're not a threat actually isn't. He means it as a caution. Don't be naive. Don't get killed by assuming the best. It's a reasonable position for someone who has been doing this as long as Carl has. But later, when Rick isn't looking, Carl goes back to the petrol station and leaves supplies for the man. Food. Just leaves it. His argument to Rick was sincere. His action was also sincere. Both things are true at the same time, which is the most interesting thing about Carl in season 8. He has grown into someone who can hold apparently contradictory positions without needing to resolve them into a single clean stance. He believes caution is necessary, and he also believes in extending basic humanity. He thinks hope isn't enough, and he also acts on hope. The man from the petrol station is Sudik. He ends up at Alexandria. He becomes a doctor. Carl's decision to leave food for him, which is really a decision to extend the chance that he might be trustworthy, pays off in exactly the way Carl probably hoped it would. Sudik outlives Carl by years and is one of the more useful members of the community. He also, indirectly, gets Carl killed. The thing I want to talk about in this section is where Carl's philosophy comes from and what it actually amounts to by the end. Because it's easy to frame it as just Carl thinks peace is possible and leave it there, but that undersells the specificity of his thinking. Carl has had teachers, not formal ones. The school that was Alexandria's makeshift education program for a season didn't do much for his moral framework, but he's had people who shaped his thinking, and tracing those influences is worth doing. Herschel is the most important one, I think. Herschel's whole argument across his time in the series is that there is a floor of decency below which you should not let yourself sink, regardless of circumstances. That you can protect yourself and your people without treating every unknown as an enemy. That restraint is not weakness. Carl watched Herschel live this argument and saw that Herschel was not eaten alive by the consequences of it, as Rick sometimes feared a soft position would be. Herschel survived by being decent, and then Herschel died eventually, and behind the scenes it was partly because of the decency, because of the governor. Negan is the other significant influence, and this is the one that sounds counterintuitive. But Carl's encounter with Negan at the sanctuary gave him a specific and important piece of information, that Negan is not purely monstrous, that there is something in him that responds to being treated as a person. Carl didn't learn this from reading about Negan or hearing about him from the group. He went and sat with him and watched him, and that's where the conviction comes from. There's also the prison and the aftermath. Carl shot a boy who was trying to put his gun down. Rick took his gun away, and Carl, in the time that followed, thought about that. Not in a way the show makes explicit, but in the way that things you've done and been held to account for stay with you. By season 8, Carl doesn't believe the answer to the saviors is just killing all of them. He's thought about what all of them means. He's thought about the surrendering boy. The other thread is Rick himself specifically, watching what the war does to Rick. Season 8. Rick is a hard Rick, an angry Rick, a Rick who has decided what needs to happen and is pursuing it without much consideration of what it costs. Carl is watching his father and seeing someone being shaped into something narrower than they used to be. And Carl, who loves his father, doesn't want that to be the end of the story. Either Rick's story or the world's story. He starts writing letters to Rick, to Michonne, and most significantly, to Negan. The Negan letter becomes the central document of the entire all-out war storyline in a way that nobody sees coming, including the viewer. What does Carl actually argue in the letter to Negan? The show communicates it through Rick reading it aloud after Carl is gone. Carl tells Negan that he thinks there's a better way, that the war is costing too much from both sides, that he believes Negan is capable of stopping it. He invokes the possibility of the future, not in a dreamy, abstract way, but concretely. There could be something worth having on the other side of this if both men choose it. Carl, writing this letter, is 14. He's been in the apocalypse since he was 11. He has killed people. He has been shot twice. He has lost his mother, his home, his security, enormous amounts of everything most people assume is just the floor of existence. And he's writing a letter to the man who killed 2 of his friends with a bat and telling him that there's still a path to something better. That's not naivety. I want to be clear about that. That's a considered, philosophical position arrived at through years of observation and thought and experience. Carl is not arguing for peace because he doesn't know how bad things can get. He's arguing for it because he's one of the few people in the show who has spent time thinking about what comes after. There's a scene near the end of his life where Carl describes a vision to Rick. He describes what Alexandria could look like, what the world could look like. Rick with a long white beard, living in a garden. Judith growing up. Negan working alongside people in the community. Not imprisoned, not destroyed. Working, contributing, being part of something. Rick at this moment is sitting with his dying son and trying to hold it together. He says he'll make it happen. He promises. And the remarkable thing is that it mostly does happen. Not exactly, and not easily, and not without a great deal more suffering. But by the end of the series, something like Carl's vision has been realised. Rick is gone by then, and Carl is gone by then, and the people carrying it forward are doing so partly on the momentum of what Carl set in motion. Judith, Carl's little sister, grows up to be exactly the kind of person Carl was describing. Not just alive, actively good, in the specific way Carl was trying to build toward. Carl had no guarantee of any of this. He was writing letters and describing visions while dying of a walker bite in the basement of a church. He had no way of knowing if any of it would come to pass. He hoped. He made the argument. He left what he could behind. That's a philosophy, and it's a complete one. And it belongs to a 17-year-old who worked it out between emergencies, in quiet moments, on catwalk platforms, and in supply runs, and in a sanctuary compound, while a man with a barbed wire bat watched him, and was, against his own expectations, moved. I find that genuinely remarkable. I don't think it gets talked about enough. The intellectual coherence of what Carl had arrived at by the time he died. He wasn't just a good kid, he had a worldview, and the world the show eventually builds reflects that worldview in ways that are only visible if you trace the line back to him. But talking a bit about how that line ends, because the ending is the part that still sits uncomfortably with most people who loved the character. Let's go to the bite. The thing that kills Carl Grimes is, in some ways, the most Carl way Carl could die. He doesn't go out in a blaze of heroism. There's no dramatic last stand against a superior force, no sacrifice to save the group from something massive and visible. He goes into a basement or a drainage area with Sadiq to help clear some walkers, because Sadiq's mother believed that clearing walkers was a way of setting something right, freeing the dead in a kind of spiritual sense. And Carl wanted to help him do that. He gets bitten during the fight. Nobody knows for a while. He keeps it hidden because there's a battle happening and people need to focus, and he knows the outcome, and there's nothing to be done about it. The bite happens off screen. We don't see it. We learn about it when Carl does, when he's alone checking his side, and there it is. That choice to not show the bite is interesting. The show could have dramatised it. It chose not to. And what that means is that the event that ends Carl's life is something we discover after the fact, the same way Carl did. By the time we know it's happened, it's already over. There's no moment of prevention to imagine, no close call to almost intervene in. It's just, it happened. What Carl does with the time he has after is the best writing the show does for his character. He keeps going first. There's a battle, and he participates in the battle, even though he's already dead essentially. He moves people through tunnels. He organises things. He does what needs to be done with the information he's keeping to himself, because the information can't help anyone right now and would only cause panic. Then he tells Rick. He shows him the bite. And Rick's reaction, that moment of complete unravelling that Andrew Lincoln plays with everything he has, is one of the actor's best moments in the series. Rick doesn't fall apart immediately. He almost doesn't believe it. He tries to think of another explanation. And then the weight of it lands. And Carl holds him. Carl is the one who is dying, and Carl is the one who holds his father through the first wave of it. Because Carl has had time to arrive at acceptance, a few hours in the tunnels, the knowledge that this is where things end, and Rick is only just now getting there. That dynamic is the most concentrated version of something the show has been building for years. Carl's capacity to be the settled one, while the adults manage their grief around him. He's been doing it since he was 12. He's doing it now, at the end, when the grief is about him. There's also the Michonne dimension. Michonne is the other parent in every meaningful sense by this point, and her response to learning about Carl's bite has a different texture from Rick's. Rick collapses into it. Michonne holds herself together in the way she always does when she's in genuine pain, very still, very quiet, the grief going inward. She helps carry Carl from the sewer. She helps Rick carry him to the church. She sits with them. She doesn't leave. These are the people Carl loved most clearly. Rick is the father he's always been trying to both honour and occasionally challenge. Michonne is the person who arrived in his life when he was old enough to choose a connection and chose her. There's a specificity to each relationship. The way he talks to Rick is different from the way he talks to Michonne. Different registers, different intimacies. And in the final hours, he's careful to be present with both of them in the way that feels right for each. The conversation with Rick about his vision of the future, the white beard, the garden, the world at peace, is one of the show's more explicitly hopeful pieces of dialogue, and it works partly because Carl is dying while he says it. He's not describing a future he'll be part of. He's describing a future he believes in, enough to name out loud in his last hours. That's the argument at full force. That's the letter before it becomes a letter. The farewell sequence takes up most of the episode, and the show gives it the time it deserves. Carl says goodbye to everyone he loves. He gives Judith his sheriff's hat. He tells her that sometimes kids have to show their parents the way, that she should be good and kind and brave. He is gentle with her in the way he has always been gentle with her, completely, without reservation, the way he never quite was with the adults in his life. He talks to Rick and Michonne in the church. He expresses remorse over the boy at the prison, the surrendering boy, the one he shot, the one Rick punished him for, and the remorse is real and specific. He talks about how easy it was to pull that trigger. That's what stays with him. Not the principle of whether he was right, but the ease of it. The fact that killing another human being was, in that moment, not hard. Carl is the only character in the show who says this plainly. Other characters struggle with taking lives in the standard ways: guilt, nightmares, visible distress. Carl's concern is different, more structural. He worries about what it means that it came naturally. That's the thought of someone who has been watching himself carefully for a long time. He tells Rick that they can't kill all the saviors, that the war can end differently. He describes the vision: Rick with a long white beard in a garden, Judith growing up, Negan in the community working alongside people. He asks Rick to promise. Rick promises. Then Carl asks for his gun. He insists on being the one to do it himself. He says goodbye to Rick and Michonne, tells them he loves them, and they leave. We hear the gunshot from outside. There is a lot that could be said about what that moment asks of the viewer. The show has, across its run, asked us to watch a lot of people die. Some of them were shocking, some were earned, some were brutal. Carl's death is different in register. It's quiet, it's deliberate, it's organised. He managed his own death the way he managed most things. Thoughtfully, practically, with the other people in the situation in mind. Rick and Michonne bury him in the Alexandria graveyard. The episode that follows spends time with what Carl's death means to different people. Rick reads his letter. Michonne mourns in a way that is quiet and dignified and slightly undone. She touches the paint handprints Carl and Judith made on the porch of their house. Carl's and Judith side by side, and can't quite handle what she's looking at. And Negan finds out. Rick calls the sanctuary on the radio and tells Negan that Carl is dead. And the show, which has given us Negan as a fairly consistent force of controlled menace across 2 seasons, gives us something different in that moment. Negan is genuinely, visibly devastated. He says Carl represented their future. We'll talk about what that means properly in the next section, but it's worth noting here that the aftermath of Carl's death is the narrative device that ends the all-out war. Carl wanted peace. Carl died wanting peace, and the letters he left, the conversations he had, the positions he'd argued, all of that becomes the mechanism through which the war actually does end. Not in the way Carl imagined exactly, not tidily, but his argument lands, his voice carries after him. That's more than most people get. There's a detail about Carl's grave that I keep coming back to. Rick hangs Carl's gun on the grave marker, the Beretta Carl always carried, and then he takes it back. He can't leave it. He holsters it. He keeps it with him. That gun, by that point, is a whole history. It's been through everything Carl went through. It's the gun Carl kept when he wasn't supposed to. It's the gun Laurie didn't want him to have. It's the gun he carried across the series and multiple losses and most of his childhood. Rick can't leave it behind, and that makes complete sense. Carl is buried. The hat is with Judith. The gun is with Rick. The letters go out. And somewhere in the sanctuary, Negan sits with news that has genuinely moved him, from a boy he visited once, who came to his compound to kill him, and sang him a song instead, and looked him in the eye, and showed him something he hadn't expected to see in a very long time. Something like a future. There's a scene in season 10 where a character named Brandon is travelling with Negan through the woods, and Brandon mentions that he heard Negan once shot Carl Grimes. Negan gets angry, corrects him, sharply. He says he would never kill a kid. He says Carl's name with a specific kind of weight that Negan does not typically attach to names. By season 10, Negan has been in a cell in Alexandria for years. He's been a prisoner. He's been treated with varying degrees of hostility and quiet contempt. He's had conversations with Michonne about Carl, about what Carl saw in Negan, about the loss of him, and the Carl-shaped thing in Negan's life has not gone away. It has stayed there, present, as maybe the only entirely uncomplicated moment of human connection Negan had in the back half of the series. Let's go back to the radio call. Rick tells Negan that Carl is dead, and Negan's grief is immediate and real. He says Carl represented their future. He asks if Negan's men killed him. There's something in the way he asks that suggests he actually needs the answer to not be yes. Rick says no. He died trying to help someone. Negan says Rick should have been there. That if Rick hadn't been running the war, he would have been there to stop Carl from doing something that got him killed. Which is a cruel thing to say to a father in that moment. And also not entirely wrong, which is a very Negan position to occupy. He says Carl was the future, and then he says the war should stop. That Carl dying for a losing battle, when all of Rick's losses since the beginning of the conflict could have been avoided, is on Rick. That argument is Negan being Negan, using the moment to push his own position, wrapping genuine grief in a rhetorical tool. But the grief is real. You can hear it. Jeffrey Dean Morgan is doing something in those scenes that goes beyond the performance he does for Negan's usual theatrics. It's quieter and more uncomfortable, the way real grief tends to be. Carl's letter to Negan is read by Michonne and then by Rick, and eventually communicated to Negan. The letter asks for peace. It argues that a world where Negan and Rick coexist is possible, and better than a world where one of them destroys the other. It references the future in a way that is specific and concrete. It asks Negan to try. The war does end shortly after Carl's death, not in the way Carl's letter imagines. There's a final confrontation between Rick and Negan, at the end of which Rick slashes Negan's throat and then immediately tells everyone to save him and keep him alive. Rick spares Negan's life, and his stated reason is Carl. He tells the assembled survivors that Carl wanted peace, that Carl believed a better world was possible, and that Negan living is the proof that they're going to try to build that world. This is one of the more controversial decisions the show makes in its later seasons, and the controversy is legitimate. A lot of people in Rick's group had very good reasons to want Negan dead, and found Rick's decision to spare him infuriating. But the Carl logic is coherent. The war ended the way Carl asked for it to end, more or less. Negan is imprisoned rather than welcomed into the community, which is not quite the vision Carl described, but it's on the path toward it. What happens to Negun after that is a long, gradual, genuinely interesting arc that stretches across multiple seasons and the spin-off Dead City. He moves from prisoner to grudging community member to something harder to categorize. He develops a relationship with Judith. He saves Judith's life. He helps keep people alive on the road. He becomes, slowly and imperfectly, something like what Carl's letter asked him to be. In Season 9, Michonne tells Negun that she sees Carl everywhere. It's a small, unguarded moment. Negun asks about her own son who died before Alexandria. She gets angry. The conversation ends. But the admission that she sees Carl everywhere lands. In Season 11, there's a moment where Negun, reflecting on his time as a prisoner and the slow work of becoming someone different, references Carl without naming him. The shape of Carl's argument is in him still. The letter is in him. There's also the Judith situation. Judith Grimes grows up to be the character who most directly carries Carl's philosophies forward. She has Carl's directness, his willingness to argue with adults, his clear-eyed assessment of hard situations. And she has a relationship with Negun that is, quietly, the realization of Carl's vision. She treats him as a person, she talks to him. She lets him keep her compass at one point. A small practical act of kindness that is exactly the kind of thing Carl would have done. Negun eventually gives the compass back. He leaves Judith a note. It says something like, "This has always helped me find my way. I'm returning it to you in the hope it can guide you to your dreams. Thank you for letting me use it." Carl didn't live to see any of that, but Carl wrote the letter that set it in motion. What I find most interesting about Negun's relationship to Carl is that it's not the relationship of a villain softened by a child's innocence. Carl was not innocent by the time they met. He'd been in the apocalypse for years. He'd killed people. He had a clear-eyed assessment of what Negun was and what Negun had done. He extended the argument for Negun's humanity, not because he didn't understand Negun's violence, but because he understood it and thought there was something beyond it. Negun responds to that, not to being seen as innocent or salvageable in some naive sense, but to being seen clearly and still treated as someone worth talking to. Carl, who had seen a lot of people become their worst selves under pressure, looked at Negun and saw the rest of the person, whatever was left. That's an extraordinary thing to do at 17. It's also an extraordinary thing to do at any age. The war that Carl asked to be ended was ended, in some measure, by his asking. The world he described has something of his shape in it. Years later, though he isn't in it, his sister is in it, and she is in some ways him continued, the same instinct, the same directness, the same refusal to give up on the idea that people can be better than their worst moments. That's what Carl meant to Negun in the end. Not just a boy who surprised him and sang him a song and looked at his empty eye socket without flinching. Carl was evidence that the thing Negun had spent years pretending didn't matter. The future, real investment in it, hope as a considered position rather than a sentimental fantasy, was actually still available. Even then, even in the sanctuary, even with all the blood on the floor, it's quite a legacy for someone who didn't make it to 18. And there's one more thread worth following here. In one of the later seasons, Michonne tells Negun that she sees Carl everywhere. She's not being metaphorical in a sentimental way. She means it practically. She sees things that remind her of Carl. She hears echoes of how he talked. She encounters situations that Carl would have had a specific response to, and the absence of that response is its own kind of presence. Grief works like that. The people who leave gaps that are shaped like them specifically, that you keep noticing in the outlines of things. Negun, who does not typically deal in sentiment, says something in return that is uncharacteristically quiet. Not a performance, not a deflection, just, yes, that's about right. They sit with that for a moment in the scene, and then move on because the conversation has gone somewhere uncomfortable for both of them, and neither of them is the type to stay somewhere uncomfortable. But the moment is real, And it's possible because of a boy who sang "You Are My Sunshine" in the sanctuary and looked knee-gun in the eye socket while knee-gun mocked his injury. Carl changed knee-gun. Not completely, not cleanly, not in a way that erases anything. But he changed him. And that matters because knee-gun changes things too later on, in a different direction, and some of those things save lives. The chain of causation is long and uncertain, as chains of causation always are. But you can trace the link if you're looking. There's a real-world story behind Carl's death that sits uncomfortably alongside the fictional one, and I think it's worth talking about because it changes how you understand the gap between what Carl was and what Carl might have been. Chandler Riggs found out his character was being killed off at what is reported to have been his high school graduation party. His father mentioned it publicly on social media. The posts have since been deleted, but the account of what happened circulated widely at the time. The details are disputed, and Chandler Riggs himself has been fairly measured in how he's talked about it publicly, since not explicitly endorsing the angrier version of events. But the basic fact is not disputed. The decision to kill Carl was made without a huge amount of warning to the actor who'd been playing him since he was 10 years old, and the timing of how he found out was, by any measure, not ideal. What's also not disputed is that the decision to kill Carl was a significant creative choice, and not one that everyone at the show agreed with at the time. Scott Gimple, who was showrunner through the All Out War arc, has talked about the decision as a deliberate narrative gambit, killing Carl to raise the stakes, to prove the show could still be unpredictable, to give Rick's story a new shape. These are legitimate creative arguments, even if you disagree with the conclusion. And I do disagree, for what it's worth. Raising the stakes by removing your most philosophically interesting character feels like burning the furniture for warmth. The problem is that Carl in the comics doesn't die. Robert Kirkman's comics, which the show adapted freely rather than faithfully, take Carl to places the show never reached. In the comics, Carl survives the war against Negan. He survives the Whisperer arc. He ends up in the time jump section of the comics as a young adult, maybe 18 or 19, living in a settlement, working as a blacksmith's apprentice, navigating the complicated feelings of someone who grew up killing and is now trying to figure out how to live in peacetime. He's in a relationship. He has a scar where his eye was. He has a dog at some point, I think. Comic Carl is one of Kirkman's most ambitious long-term character projects, the project of showing what it looks like when a child formed by apocalypse violence reaches adulthood and tries to integrate that into a stable life. It's uncomfortable and interesting and genuinely unlike anything else in long-form zombie fiction. Show Carl stops at 17, at the moment of clarity, just before the resolution. There's an argument to be made, and some people make it, that the show's version is, in a strange way, more mythologically complete. Carl dying right at the point where his philosophy is most fully formed. Right when he's seen the most clearly. Right when his vision of the future is the most coherent. That's a kind of tragic perfection. He doesn't have to live through the messy compromise of seeing his ideas partially realised and partially not. He leaves the vision whole. I don't fully buy that argument. I think it's a retrospective justification for a decision made on other grounds, but I understand why people reach for it. What I do think is true is that the show visibly struggles in the seasons after Carl's death to find someone to hold the function he held. Not the dramatic function. The show found plenty of drama, but the quieter one. The person who thinks ahead. The person who watches Negan and draws a conclusion nobody else draws. The person who writes the letter. The show assigns parts of this function to different characters with mixed results. Judith ends up carrying the most of it, and Judith is genuinely good. The later seasons version of Judith is well written, and the actress who plays her, Kaylee Fleming, is excellent. But Judith is too young in the immediate aftermath of Carl's death to fill the space, and by the time she's old enough, the show is in its final seasons and the structure is different. The Whisperer arc, which takes up seasons 9 and 10, and is arguably the show's strongest creative period after season 4, would have been extremely interesting with Carl in it. The Whisperers are a group who live among the dead, who have opted entirely out of the project of rebuilding civilization, who have concluded that survival requires becoming indistinguishable from what you fear. That's a philosophical antagonist, and Carl's specific brand of thinking, his argument that you can be better than your worst circumstances, is exactly what that antagonist calls for. The conversations he could have had with Alpha or Beta or any of the Whisperer hierarchy would have been genuinely compelling. Instead, we got what we got, which was strong in many ways but missing something specific. Chandler Riggs has moved on to other projects. He seems to be doing well. He's talked about The Walking Dead with something like warmth, mostly. He grew up on that show in the most literal sense. And whatever complicated feelings he has about how it ended are understandably private. He did the job he was given with unusual commitment and unusual skill, and the character he created is one of the more interesting things the series produced. The behind-the-scenes reality doesn't change the character. Carl is still what he was across the whole series, but knowing the context does change how you watch the later seasons. There's a particular kind of hollowness to the space where Carl should be that makes more sense when you know the circumstances. One more thing about what was lost. Carl and Daryl had a dynamic that the show used sparingly, but that was always interesting when it appeared. They didn't say much to each other, usually. Daryl is not a talker, and Carl had learned to communicate effectively, without a lot of words, but there was a mutual recognition between them. Two people who had processed loss by making themselves harder without making themselves cold. The moment in Season 8 where Daryl argues with Rick about Carl, about what Carl's death means, and what keeping Negan alive in Carl's name costs. You feel the weight of Daryl's investment in the argument. He would have died for Carl, he says so. That's real. The show that kept Carl would have been a different show. Not necessarily better in every dimension. The deaths and losses that the series is built around are part of its DNA, but different in a specific and probably meaningful way. The Carl-shaped absence in seasons 9 through 11 is something the show works around rather than fills, and that's worth naming. Here's a fun detail that sits alongside the behind-the-scenes conversation, and that I think gets overlooked in the discourse around Carl Chandler Riggs. Was 18 when the episode aired.de aired. He'd been doing this work since he was 10. That's a full decade of his life, from childhood into adulthood, in the middle of one of the most watched and discussed television dramas of its era. Whatever his private feelings about how it ended, the public work he did was extraordinary by any measure. The character he built, carefully, over years, growing into it the way you grow into your dad's hat, is one of the more fully realised long-form character arcs in prestige television. That doesn't go away because of how it ended. I think it's also worth noting that the criticism most commonly directed at Carl's death, that it wasted the character, that it cheated the audience, that it removed the show's moral compass at exactly the moment it needed one, is, in a backhanded way, a testament to how well Chandler Riggs did the job. The audience was furious because they cared. You can't manufacture that kind of attachment. You earn it across a decade of showing up and doing the work honestly. Carl was loved. The show let him go. The two things can both be true. The Walking Dead comic ran from 2003 to 2019, concluding with issue 193. Robert Kirkman's decision to end it was famously abrupt. He didn't announce it in advance. He just finished it and published a note explaining that the story was done. No farewell tour, no extended goodbye, which is a very Kirkman move, as it too Robert Kirkman said, "This is the end of The Walking Dead. That's it. It's over. We're done." Thanks. I appreciated it, honestly. It felt right for a series that never really went in for sentiment. Comic Carl is one of the main reasons the ending lands the way it does. I want to be careful here about spoiling the comic in any granular way, partly because some people might still want to read it, and partly because the specific plot events matter less than the shape of what the comic does with Carl. But in general terms, Carl survives. Carl grows up. The comic shows you in a time jump section who Carl becomes as an adult. And it's one of the more interesting things Kirkman does across the watch of the show, and the comic share broadly the same basic Carl through roughly season 5 or 6, even if some major story beats are changed or handed to other characters. 5 or 6. The childhood, the hat, the eye, all of that tracks. The relationships with Rick, Herschel, Michonne are essentially the same. The core of who Carl is, his philosophical development, his tendency toward positions the adults haven't reached yet, that's in both versions. Where they diverge is in where all of that goes. Show Carl's death, as we talked about earlier, freezes him at the point of his clearest vision. He dies articulate and certain and whole, having just written his best argument for the future he believes in. That's a particular kind of character conclusion, the one who knew, who saw clearly, who left the knowledge behind. It's complete in its way. Comic Carl has to live with what he knows, and living with it turns out to be complicated in ways the show never had to explore. Adult comic Carl carries significant visible damage. The eye wound, which the comic depicts without a prosthetic or much covering, is more prominent than the show's bandaged version. He's someone you look at and immediately understand has been through something. And he's in the process, in the comic's later chapters, of figuring out what normal means for someone with his specific history. He's working with his hands. He's in a relationship. He's part of a community in the ordinary, daily sense, not as a young hero or a philosophical voice, but as a person doing their share. What the comic explores and what the show couldn't because it ended Carl's story early is the aftermath of an unusual childhood. How do you have a relationship when your emotional history is what Carl's is? How do you make peace with the things you did when you were 12 or 13, when the things you did were sometimes terrible and sometimes necessary and sometimes both? How do you want things in peacetime when you spent years training yourself not to want things because wanting things made you vulnerable? These are genuinely hard questions, and the comic gives them genuine space. There's also a specific dynamic in the comic between adult Carl and Negan that is considerably different from what the show develops. I won't detail it, but the short version is adult Carl and Negan have a direct confrontation about what Negan did and what that means, and the conversation is not comfortable for either of them. Carl gets to say things to Negan that show Carl never lived to say, and Negan has to account for himself in a more personal and immediate way than the show ever requires of him. The show's Negan arc, the imprisonment, the slow redemption, the relationship with Judith is good. It does different things. It just doesn't have Carl in it. So the accountability that Carl would have specifically demanded is redistributed across other characters in ways that don't quite replicate the original force of it. The time jump section of the comic, which moves the story forward years into what the world looks like after the war, is in some ways the most science-fictional thing Kirkman does in the whole series. Not because of any particular technological development, but because it imagines a future. It asks you to believe that the world can stabilize, that communities can endure, that children who grew up in horror can grow into something other than horror. It's optimistic in a way that is hard-earned, and therefore more affecting than optimism that comes easy. Carl is central to that optimism in the comic, because Carl being alive and functioning, and in a relationship, and making things with his hands, is the embodiment of the argument. He made it. He is the evidence that the project of surviving and building was worth it. The show makes a similar argument, eventually, through Judith and through the communities in the final episodes. But it's doing it without Carl, which means it's doing it one step removed from where the argument originates. Here's what I think is genuinely interesting about comparing the two versions. They're not competing, they're exploring different aspects of the same character idea. Show Carl is the character who shows you what it looks like to have a clear vision and not make it to see it realised. Comic Carl is the character who shows you what it looks like to have a clear vision and have to live inside the imperfect version of it that reality produces. Both of those are true to life in different ways. Some people die with their vision intact, not yet tested by the messiness of actual implementation. Some people live to see what happens when the world tries to approximate what they hoped for, and mostly does, imperfectly, with compromises on every side. The hat ends up in the same place in both versions, more or less, on Judith's head. That's a nice piece of continuity. The hat travels the same road regardless of which version you're following, which says something about the hat, and about Judith, and about the fact that certain things, certain ideas, certain objects, certain relationships carry forward beyond the individual people who held them. Carl is one of those things that carries forward. In both versions and in the real conversation people still have about the show years after it ended. That's not a small legacy. Now, since we're on the topic of the quieter corners of Carl's story, the things that don't make the highlight reels, but that accumulate into something important, let me spend some time with a few specific scenes that I think deserve a bit more light than they usually get. After the prison falls in season 4 and the group is scattered across the Georgia countryside, there's an episode called After that follows Carl and Rick in the days immediately following the collapse. Rick is barely functional. He got beaten badly in the governor's final assault, and he's concussed or worse and can barely stay conscious. They find a house. Rick passes out on the sofa. Carl is on his own. And what Carl does, alone in an unfamiliar house with his father unconscious and the world outside full of everything it's always full of, is scout the house. Secure what he can, find food, eat some of it, while resenting how insufficient it is, nearly get killed by a walker that turns out to be more mobile than expected, and eventually sit outside on the roof with an enormous, industrial tin of chocolate pudding and eat all of it. Not some of it, all of it. He sits up there on the roof in the weak Georgia sun with a tin of chocolate pudding the size of his head, and a spoon, and he just goes at it. It's such an extraordinarily teenager thing to do. He nearly died. He doesn't know where anyone else from the group is. His father is unconscious inside. Everything is terrible. And there is chocolate pudding. You eat the episode then cuts to Carl inside, writing on the door. The wall. He writes, "I got out and you didn't, arsehole." About the walker that nearly got him. Scrawling on the wall of a stranger's house. Also very teenager. These two moments in sequence, the pudding on the roof, the graffiti on the wall, are, I would argue, some of the most human things the show gives Carl in the whole series. They're the moments where the character stops carrying the weight of everything the show needs him to carry, and is just a 14-year-old having a strange, bad, somehow funny day. They're lovely. And then there's the Carl and Michonne relationship, which is one of the show's more quietly excellent things, and which operates almost entirely in the margins. Michonne joins the group at the end of season 2 and is kept at arm's length by almost everyone for most of season 3, because she is prickly and closed and carrying things she doesn't share. Carl, who has no particular agenda, starts paying attention to her. He doesn't push, he just keeps noticing. There's a moment in season 3 where he follows her through an abandoned town looking for supplies and ends up helping her retrieve something that turns out to be a framed drawing from a house. She was specifically looking for it. He doesn't ask why, he just helps her carry it back. Later, he draws her a portrait. He leaves it for her to find. She keeps it. The Carl-Michonne dynamic settles, by season 4, into something that looks like an older sibling and a younger sibling who have worked out how to be close without making a big deal of it. She reads comics with him. He tells her about his mother. They have a running bit where Michonne pretends to like things that Carl doesn't like, and Carl is irritated about this in a fond way. It's easy and specific and real. Michonne ends up as a parent figure to Carl in the later seasons, in a way that the show handles with some care. She and Rick are together, which makes her a step-parent of sorts, but the Carl-Michonne relationship has its own independent texture that predates and is separate from her relationship with Rick. It was established in those small moments, the portrait, the comics, the abandoned town, before any of the romantic dimension. The moment Rick touches Carl's handprint on the porch after his death is one of the show's most restrained and effective pieces of grief. Of grief, no dialogue. Just a woman touching a paint handprint, Carl's print next to Judith's, on the porch of the house they shared. She can't look at it for long. She goes inside. That handprint doesn't get a lot of screen time in the episodes preceding Carl's death. It's just there, on the porch, existing, but the show remembered it was there and used it at exactly the right moment. Now, Herschel and Carl in the yard again, but with a specific addition. In Season 4, Herschel has recovered from his amputation and is doing a fairly remarkable job of being the prison's most functional person, while everyone else is managing the flu outbreak. There are walkers against the fence, as always, and Carl goes out with Herschel to pick elderberries or something, and Herschel tells Carl he doesn't need to shoot the walker. Carl puts the gun away. They keep walking. Herschel remarks that it's peaceful out there, and Carl points at a walker with an animal trap clamped to its leg, dragging itself across the ground. Which, yes, not exactly peaceful, but the walk continues. This small scene contains a whole argument about how to live in the apocalypse, whether you kill everything that might be a threat or whether you make distinctions. Carl, who's been erring on the side of killing things for a couple of seasons, lets Herschel make the distinction and accepts it. It's a tiny concession and it takes maybe 30 seconds of screen time, but it's the seed of the position Carl arrives at years later. The idea that not everything needs to be destroyed, that some things can just be left. There are other small moments, Carl bringing baby formula back from a run during the prison season, going out specifically to find it when Judith needs it, and getting the formula and making it back. Carl on his own, doing a specific and important task without fanfare. Carl in the church in Season 5, during one of the group's brief stops there, finding a Bible and reading it. He's not religious as far as the show establishes, but he's curious. He's always curious. He reads the Bible the same way he reads comics, because it's there and because he's interested in what it says. Carl and Morgan, their first meeting in Season 3. Morgan is clearly not in a good place psychologically. He's been alone for a long time, and it has cost him something, and Carl's approach to him is gentle, in a way that's slightly surprising, given how Carl has been operating lately. He apologises for shooting Morgan, which he did earlier in the episode, out of a reasonable threat assessment. Never be sorry, Morgan tells him. They look at each other for a moment. Two people who have made hard calls and are carrying them differently. Carl and Judith, across all the seasons she's present. He's her big brother. He talks to her, shows her things, carries her around, is patient with her in a way he isn't always patient with other people. There's a scene somewhere in Season 5 or 6 where Carl is looking after Judith and just talking to her. She's an infant, she doesn't understand anything he's saying, and what he's saying is just ordinary stuff. About the day, about what he's thinking. Like he'd talk to a friend. I don't remember the exact scene, but I remember the feeling of it. And then there's the moment where he gives her the hat. The hat going from Rick to Carl to Judith is the whole series in 3 objects. Not a speech, not an explanation. Just, here is this thing. It's yours now. Keep going. Carl could not have known, when he pressed that hat onto Judith's head, on what he knew was one of his last days, exactly what she'd do with it. He couldn't have known she'd wear it into battle, that she'd have conversations with Negan about it, that she'd be the person who carries the family name and something of the family spirit forward into a world he wouldn't see. He just knew she should have it. That's the last and maybe the best of the small moments. Not a grand gesture, a practical one. The right object to the right person at the right time. The same instinct that left comics on Michonne's bed and food at a petrol station and a kiss at Hilltop Gate. Carl Grimes was very good at knowing what things were worth and passing them on. There are a handful of other moments scattered across the seasons that deserve a mention, even briefly. Carl asking Michonne in one of their early quiet conversations what she misses from before. It's the kind of question most people don't ask, because the answer is too large and too sad, and Carl asks it straightforwardly, genuinely curious, prepared to sit with whatever she says. Michonne, who is not given to confiding in people, says something true. Carl doesn't try to fix it or redirect. He just listens. That's a particular skill and a particular kindness. Carl, during the stretch in Season 4, when the prison group is scattered and Rick is barely functioning, the days when Carl goes out alone to scavenge and comes back with what the situation needs and doesn't ask Rick for permission or reassurance. He's doing what needs to be done. He's angry too in those days. There's a stretch where he talks to an unresponsive Rick about how he can make it on his own, about not needing his father, about the ways Rick has failed, and then Rick wakes up on the sofa and Carl almost loses himself entirely with relief. Both things are true, the anger and the relief, the independence and the need. That's very 14 actually. 14 is usually both of those things at the same time. And the comic books Carl keeps and reads and shares. The show uses them mostly as set dressing. You see them in his cell, you see him carrying them, but the choice to make Carl a reader is a meaningful one. He's someone who engages with stories, who finds things in fiction that are useful for understanding the world he's in. In a show where literacy is not really foregrounded as a character trait, the fact that Carl reads for pleasure says something about who he is and what he values and what he thinks the inside of his head is for. We come back, at the end, to the hat. Judith is wearing it in the final episodes of The Walking Dead. She wears it into the Commonwealth. She wears it on supply runs. She wears it in quiet moments around Alexandria. It's slightly too big for her, which is exactly how it was when Carl first put it on. These things move through families like that. A little too much at first, a little too large, and then over time you grow into them. Judith is not Carl. She's her own person, with her own story, her own relationships, her own version of the argument about what kind of world to build. But she carries something of what Carl was building toward, the directness, the willingness to look at hard situations clearly and without flinching, the instinct to extend a hand to someone unexpected. Those things came from somewhere, and some of where they came from is what Carl was, and what he tried to pass on in letters and conversations and small gestures before he had to go. Carl Grimes was in The Walking Dead from the first season to he was 10 years old when they started filming, and 18 when his last episode aired. aired. The character was 11 at the beginning of the story and 17 at the end. 8 years of television, 8 years of growing up, both the actor and the character, at the same time, in the same world, doing the same impossible work. What I keep coming back to, thinking about Carl, is the specific texture of his intelligence. He was smart in a way the apocalypse made necessary, and then continued past necessity into something like philosophy. He noticed things. He kept track of things. He changed his mind when the evidence warranted it, and didn't change it when the evidence didn't. He made connections between ideas, between the surrendering prisoner and the knee gun letter, between the sanctuary visit and the argument for peace, between what Herschel showed him in the yard and what the world could look like if you extended that restraint. He was 15, not an even teen. He worked all of that out between the ages of 11 and 17, in the middle of an ongoing catastrophe, without a school or a library or any of the ordinary structures through which people usually develop intellectual lives. That might be the most accurate way to understand what Carl Grimes did in the end. He changed people. He changed Rick in the last hours of Rick's time in Alexandria, broke something open in Rick that produced the decision to spare Negan, which changed the whole shape of the world the show builds toward. He changed Negan, directly and personally. He shaped Judith by being her brother, by giving her the hat, by being the standard she grew into. He did all of this while being a 17-year-old who also ate an entire industrial tin of chocolate pudding alone on a roof during one of the worst weeks of his life. That's the thing about Carl, finally. He was both of those things. At once. Always. The philosopher and the kid. The steady one and the frightened one. The person who wrote peace letters while dying in a church, and the person who scrawled, "I got out and you didn't, arsehole," on a stranger's wall. Both of those are him. Both of those matter. I don't know that the show fully understood what it had with Carl. Not in those terms. The show was always better at the dramatic and the visceral than at the quiet and the philosophical, and Carl's most interesting qualities lived in the quiet. Which is why this kind of video exists, I suppose. To go back and look. There are more of these coming. More character deep dives, more time spent in the corners of this universe that the main show visited briefly or not at all. If you have a character you'd like me to spend some time with, leave it in the comments. There's a lot of story in this world that's worth sitting with, slowly. And if you've made it this far and you're drifting off, I hope it was a good night's listening. Carl Grimes is a good person to spend a few hours with. He was thoughtful and strange and steady in ways that don't get enough credit. The hat fits Judith now. Good night.